Hello, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Okay, so last week I made a video advising people or giving guidance to people about buying gear unnecessarily. Buying gear because marketing people tell you it's going to make you sound better, make you sound like so-and-so, or just really just buying gear for the sake of buying gear. GAS, G-A-S, gear acquisition syndrome, which we all know about. Now, in that video, I mentioned about plugins, and I mentioned that on my beta testing machine, I've got about 4,000 plugins, but I probably only use about 20 of those on a day-to-day basis. So, of course, the first question that I get when I release that video is, what are those 20 plugins? And then I got more questions and more, and I've now had multiple requests to make a video about those 20 plugins. And that's what I'm going to do. Let's jump in. Okay, so I've got all the plugins loaded in Studio One and I'm going to run through them one by one. What this is not going to be is a breakdown of every single plugin. I'm just going to quickly go through the plugins, maybe play some examples through them, but I'm not going to be playing audio examples through every single plugin because it would just take forever. This is really kind of a quick video showing you the 20 plugins which I tend to use on a daily basis. Some I've been using for a long time, some have changed, and I want to point out that this isn't a definitive list because it does change. However, I did think about it for quite some time and I narrowed it down to 20 plugins which I would say I pretty much use on every single mix that I do for a client or myself, or some of them are just like that are just using my mastering for clients. So it's a mixture of my mixing plugins and my mastering plugins, but I would say that I use these probably on every single mix or master. So we're going to run through them one by one. Some of them it's a little bit of a cheat, and I'll explain in a second because there's actually more than one plugin to that one plugin, if that makes sense, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. But we'll just run through them. There's compressors, EQs, reverbs, delays, etc., in there. We'll start off with the 1176. So the 1176 compressor is kind of a go-to for everybody. You can kind of use it on anything. I tend to use it on vocals and occasionally drums and occasionally bass, but it tends to be for vocals for me. I tend to stack them with the LA2A, but the 1176 is just a classic compressor. Now, there are multiple versions of the 1176 in plugin form and also in hardware form because you have the original and loads of people have released clones as well. But I've been using the UAD version for quite some time. The reason why I like the UAD version is because it offers you 3 different 1176s. This particular 1176 has got ratios that go down to 2, which is not what the others have. The standard 1176 tends to be 4, 8, 12, 20, whereas this one you can go all the way down to 2, so it's a lot more subtle, so it's nicer to use on acoustic instruments maybe, where you need less compression. But it's a super fast compressor, and that's why people tend to use it for catching peaks, that kind of thing. So it's a go-to. But Waves do a decent version. I want to give an honourable mention to the CLA 76, the Bluey. I love that on guitars. It's fantastic. Actually, I do use 1176 on guitars quite a lot as well. Maybe synth leads too. So 1176, I use that in every single mix, without a doubt, at some point. Moving on to the LA2A. Now, this is UAD's version again. Again, there's multiple versions of it from different plugin companies. I've just used the UAD version for a long time, and I like it. I like that it imprints a little bit of a sound, a little bit of character. There's 3 different versions of this as well. I don't tend to use this one very often. It's a leveling amplifier. That's what LA means basically. And it's a nice subtle compressor that I will use on, I'll stack them 1176 into the LA2A for vocals. I'll also use it on bass quite a lot. I use it on dialogue just on its own without the 1176. I use it on my YouTube videos. Pretty much every single YouTube video has an LA2A on the dialogue, and it's good for things that you might not need a compressor on. That sounds stupid. it can be a subtle compressor. So it's good for things like horns, pads, stringed instruments, things that you don't really need super fast compression on. You just kind of need leveling out. And that's what the LA2A is good for. And I love it. I've loved it for years. And I do tend to use the UAD version. Again, Waves does a decent version. I think there's multiple versions and I can't think off the top of my head. Akai Multimedia, I think, do a decent version. Overloud do a decent version. I think I can see them in my head, but I can't think what the companies are. But the UAD is the one that I tend to reach for. So you've got multiple versions of it. This one I tend to use on bass, and this one I tend to use on vocals. They've all got a little bit of a different sound to them, and they all react very slightly differently to sources. Next plugin, the SSL G bus. Again, I do tend to reach for the UAD version, just again because I've used it for such a long time and I know how it behaves. And I love the fact that you have the sidechain filter down here so you can get rid of any bass. This is probably on and has been on virtually every single mix that I have done, at least in the last, my goodness me. I mean, I used to use the hardware, so probably going back 40 years. Maybe in the 90s, I didn't tend to use it much because I didn't have access to the hardware and they didn't have plugins at that point. But certainly when Waves first released a version of it as a plugin, from that point onwards, I was using Waves. And then onto the UAD version. I may have been using that previous to the Waves version. And Overloud do a decent version of it. Akai Multimedia do a decent version. Native Instruments do a decent version. There's free versions out there. It's a glue compressor, bus compressor, but you don't have to just use it for that. I use it on drum buses as well. Don't tend to use it on things like vocals. It's more of a sort of general purpose compressor for bus compression, hence it being called the G bus compressor. It's just a good all-rounder, basically, and I do tend to reach for the UAD version, but it's on every mix. DBX 160, if you watch my videos, you've seen me use this before on drums. I love it on drums. It's just got such a fat, snappy sound, and you can get a really over-compressed sound to it, snappy and crushed, but it doesn't crush the dynamic range. It's really odd. Does that make sense? Not really. What I mean is you can still keep dynamics and still keep the transients, but you can get a nice crushed sound from it. Doesn't really make any sense, does it? The more I say it, the less sense it makes. But I love the DBX 160. Again, I do tend to reach for the UAD version of it. Who else does a version? Arturia do a decent version, but I think that's the DBX 165. There's a couple of free versions out there that I know knocking around, and Waves do a decent version of it as well. But I do prefer the UAD version. It's just got a certain character to it. It's the one piece of hardware that I actually miss. I used to have two of these. They were matched and they were fantastic, and I do miss them. And although I didn't compare the UAD version to the original hardware, from memory, it sounds or reacts, behaves as close to the hardware as I remember. Like I said, didn't compare them. So I'm not sitting here saying this is an exact emulation, but I like what it does to drums, and that's what I tend to use it for. Next, another well-known compressor, the API 2500. Waves do a decent version of it, but I do again tend to reach for the UAD. This is not an advert for UAD, by the way. I'm not affiliated with Universal Audio in any way. I don't even beta test for them. I'm not trying to make anybody buy their stuff. They're just go-tos for me. They have been for a long time. It dates back to the days where I was using the satellite, which is an external box, which basically means you can use the plugins without taxing your computer at all. It was when computers were slower. I still use that same satellite 10 or so years later. So I don't need to save as much of the processing power on my computer anymore, because obviously computers are a lot more powerful now, but I still use it. And it also means that I can travel anywhere with different laptops and just plug that satellite straight in, and I've got access to all of my UAD plugins. And that's why I still use their plugins. And I know they get knocked by people, they're kind. It's a bit of a Marmite thing. I think people either go, no, I can't stand them, they're ridiculous, they're outdated, and then you've got other people, too many to mention, mixing engineers that I can think of. Pretty much everybody I can think of, actually. Pensado, Sheps, Joshua, all of them. They all use UAD. And it's probably for the same reason as I did. I started using them. It's just simply because you could use them without taxing your processing power. And they're great sounding plugins. So the API 2500, I tend to use for drums. I don't tend to use it as a bus compressor. I find it a little bit over the top, even on really, really low ratios. So you've got right down to 1.5, which is lower than you can get on the G bus, but it just even with the mix dial back, it can still sound a little bit too punchy for me. But drums, it's amazing. On my drum bus, it's pretty much on every single drum bus. Just quickly going back to, that's pretty much on every single mix bus that I use, master out. That's pretty much on every single low perk bus, so snares, claps, etc. I tend to use it on snares and claps. Congas as well, really good on congas. But this will be my drum bus go-to pretty much. Occasionally there's a Plugin Alliance plugin that's the name escapes me that I use, but this is my go-to. It really is. Okay, look at the GUI on this plugin. It's so old school and it's been around forever, but I absolutely love it. It's not on every single mix bus, but it's on a lot. It's a magic mojo secret voodoo plugin that just does something to mixes. It's one of those plugins that, and I've actually heard a mix engineer tell a story about this, but his name escapes me. Oh, my memory's getting worse, I'm telling you. It's the story that he tells is that he was in the studio with an artist and they were doing the mix down and the artist was sat behind him and he just switched this on and the artist kind of sat up straight away and said, "What have you just done? Now that sounds like a record." And that's what it does. You have to be subtle with it, but you literally can stick it on right near the end when you're getting close to printing and it just brings everything together. It's a multi-band compressor, really. That's what it does. But it doesn't really... Well, this is the thing. It's linear phase. So the argument would be that it wouldn't imprint any kind of character or flavor, but it does. It's like the Waves L2. It's a familiar sound. And I can guarantee there's a whole bunch of tracks that you've heard that use this on the master bus. And I use it for that very reason. It's really nice when you've got a mix that's got like full vocals, a load of synths, guitars, loads of stuff going on, and you're having a bit of an issue, because all of us do, with mixes that have just got multiple sources going on, multiple frequency ranges, panning all over the place. This takes it one step further than a mix bus compressor would, and it just kind of makes everything gel together because it's individually compressing each individual thing. Now, I've used other multi-band compressors before. FabFilter do an amazing one. There's a Softtube do a really, really nice one based on a vintage piece of hardware. There's loads out there, but this one just does something magical that none of the rest of them do. For me, I'm not saying it's gonna work for you all the time, but for me, it just does something magical. And I rarely play around with the crossovers. I might individually play around with the thresholds on each individual section, but to be honest, I literally grab this and I drag it down, and as soon as it starts bouncing a little bit, that's where I leave it, and it just reels it in and just makes it sound just polished and nice. So that's from Waves, and you can probably pick it up from them for about $5 now, I would imagine. Waves plugins for ridiculous prices now. Another Waves plugin, another magic plugin, MV2. So MV2 is kind of like a upward-downward compressor. So you can push up the noise floor and you can compress the peaks. So you're reducing the dynamic range. It's really, really good on bass. It's decent on vocals. So it's very, very good on instruments that naturally have big dynamic ranges. And you don't want to squash them. I'm not a big fan of squashing things so it looks like a rectangle when you look at it. But it's good for just reeling it in, just, kind of bringing the dynamic range, evening things out, the quiet notes or the quiet part of a vocal and the louder part of a vocal, just reducing the difference, the dynamic range between those two levels. So MV2, again, I mean, look at the GUI. It's mentally simple and mentally good, in my opinion. Again, from Waves, and very old plugin as well. So a newer plugin, a couple of years old now, but now, just quickly to be transparent, I do beta test for Acoustical Audio. I'm part of their street team. I'm allowed to say there's no non-disclosure agreement with Acoustical Audio. It's emulation or Acoustical Audio kind of capture. It's difficult to explain. They're not emulating as such, and they've kind of captured the sound of things, and like clippers, reverbs, compressors, EQs, etc. And Ash captures the sound of various converters, the Lavry, things like that. And since they sent it to me, I would say this is, as a clipper, I've probably used this on every single master. So in the last, say, 2-3 years since it came out, maybe 2 years, could be 3 years, I probably average around about 150 to 200 masters a year for clients. So that's how many masters I've used it on. And I've also used it on every single master that I've, for my own tracks. So I will combine it with Standard Clip, which is another go-to clipper, but I wanted to pick one or the other, and I went for Ash. You have a whole bunch of different converters and emulated here. Platinum Maker I use quite a lot. Yellow K3 I use quite a lot as well. But it's very simple to use, and it just does the job. It's just, as a clipper, it's my favorite clipper probably. And like I said, every single master since it came out. Studer tape emulation. This tends to go on my drum bus. It's the only thing I tend to use it on. Now, I've seen a lot of people use it on every single bus, and there are a lot of people that say use it on the master out, and that will give the overall sound to it. But I just tend to use it on my drum bus. And, again, very, very simple. The way that I tend to use it is I'll push it with the input. So it's just about going into 0, and then I'll bring it back the same amount on the output. Simple as that. And again, it just adds a really nice low end. It's not a on the 456 at 15 IPS, if you want to start getting real character, you can start going for the 250 maybe with 7.5, or the 456 7.5. These are different tape stocks. The 456 from Ampex is a tape that I used to use a lot. I'm very, very familiar with how it sounds and how it reacts at different IPSs. And I tend to leave it 3 or 6 there. But it's a really nice, actually you can open this as well and you can play with it. It's nice if you push the high frequencies. But it's just really, really good on the drum bus. And that's how I tend to use it. Occasionally I use it on vocals, occasionally on bass, but I don't use it on the mix bus. It's got too much character for me. UAD, which is the guys that made this one, they do make another mastering tape emulation, which is the ATR 102, I think. I did go for a period of using it on the master bus out, but it just, again, there's just too much there. It's too much character. So I started using it in parallel and just introducing a little bit of character. And in the end, I just thought, why am I using it? I'm just using it for the sake of it because it looks nice. This one does look nice, but also it's really, really good on the drum bus. So another plugin from UAD there. I reckon out of my top 20, there's probably 10 plugins from them. Okay, so here we go. This is from Sonox. Now, this is actually UAD's version, but it's from Sonox. Oxford Inflator, famous plugin. Loads of people use it. It's really big in club music, house music, hip hop, EDM, that kind of thing. It's just magical what it does. And that's a little bit over the top. I don't think I've ever used it that much. I use it on the drum bus. You can see I've got it as a default. When I open it, it just instantly opens up with my settings for my drum bus. And it's just really nice to, I don't tend to mix into it straight away. I tend to maybe bring it in a bit later on, but it sits on my drum bus. It's pretty much probably been on my drum bus every drum bus that I've done mix-wise since it came out. I've actually got the original 32-bit version, which I still go back to sometimes because I've got a plugin which enables me to use 32-bit plugins on a 64-bit system. Does it sound any different? I don't know. In my mind, it does because it just looks older. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but there obviously is some difference in the coding. We could argue all day long whether it sounds any different, but sometimes just because maybe I want to look at a different GUI, I go for the 32-bit version. And the 32-bit version looks like it was made on Commodore 64. But it's a fantastic plugin, and you just kind of dial it in with this effect here. This effect is also available on the Oxford limiter, which I do actually use quite a lot as well, but I didn't choose that limiter. We'll get to limiters in a bit. Oxford Inflator, like I said, just push that up a little bit on your drums and everything just sounds polished. It just sounds amazing. I love it. I could probably make a video just about this, explaining what it does, and still at the end of it, not really know what it does. So now we're getting into EQ and stuff. Now obviously there is compressors on the SSL channel strips, but I'm putting it in the EQ section because I would say that out of all of the mixes that I do, definitely at one point there will be an SSL channel strip in there. Now I've chosen the Waves one because out of all of the times that I use an SSL channel strip, UAD do a great one. Pretty much every plugin company does a version of it. I mean, you could even argue that MPC, for instance, with the Air channel strip in there, that's kind of SSL-esque. I'm not saying it's exactly an SSL. There's obviously some other things in there as well, but there is pretty much, for me, the Waves E channel I really, really like, especially with the analog on. It just does something weird. I don't know whether it makes it sound like an analog desk. I don't actually care whether it sounds like an analog desk or not, but I like what it does when you turn the analog on. It might be pushing the harmonics a little bit, adding a little bit of saturation. Don't know. But the E channel, I use a lot on vocals. I use a lot on percussion. I use a lot on synths. The G channel from Waves as well. It's a different version, a more updated version of the SSL desk, the G desk. I will use that on percussion. Actually, I'll probably say that the G channel is my go-to for percussion. The Plugin Alliance do an even newer version of an SSL desk, which I use sometimes as well. That's really nice. UAD's version, the legacy version of this, is really, really nice if you just want to go to channel strip. But, you know, literally, if somebody said to me, you can only use one plugin throughout an entire mix, it probably would be an SSL channel of some sort. I like some of the Neve channels, the Neve channel strips, and I like some of the API channel strips, but just because of the music that I've tended to mix over the years, house music, hip hop, I've tended to use an SSL, and also because it was one of the first desks that I was lucky enough to work on as a kid in the 80s. Growing up, I spent a lot of time on an SSL desk. So I'm just familiar with the curves, what the EQs do. And I've got to say it, you know, again, people might give me a thumbs down for this, but out of all of the SSL channel strips, the E channel for me is how I remember the SSL desk. That's how I remember it. I get the sound, the way the compressor and gate reacts, especially the way that the high pass and low pass behave, the way that the low end behaves, is how I remember it. But again, I haven't compared them side by side, and I'm not saying it's an exact emulation. And I'm also going to say again, I don't care. I just like the sound of it, and I do use it pretty much in every single mix at some point. Okay, so this is a kind of go-to for everybody. And I suppose if somebody said to me, if you were only allowed to use one EQ in a track, it probably would be FabFilter, because it's just so versatile for dynamic EQ. You can turn it into a compressor. You can do so much with it. You have so many different settings. I haven't actually got into using the Q4 yet, just purely because I've got so many projects on the go where some of them are half mixed, and the Pro Q3 is already on there. I've got the Pro Q4 on one of my other portable laptop rigs, so I'm kind of trying it out. It seems great. There's a few extra little tricks that it has up its sleeve, but the Pro Q3 is the one which I've used for years. I've used the FabFilter Pro Q since it came out, actually, right from the start, and it just gets better and better. It's in every single mastering chain, pretty much, and I use it pretty much on every single mix that I do as well. I don't use it on every channel. I will use it. I tend to use it for surgical work. If I want character EQ, I'll go for a Pultec SSL and the EQ that I'm going to show you in a second. But it's a great surgical EQ and a great dynamic EQ. And as I said, you can actually use it. You can set it up almost as a multi-band compressor as well. It's just endless. What you can do with this plugin is absolutely endless. So that's a go-to EQ plugin for me, definitely. This is go-to for me on the mix bus and in mastering. It's kind of a Pultec on steroids. I love it. I've used the hardware. Does it sound like the hardware? Don't care. But I love it as a plugin, and it made the top 20 because I use it on a daily basis. I would say this is probably, since it was released, it's probably been on every single mix bus. I would say, yeah, every single mix bus. I don't tend to use it in mastering. I will use it occasionally in mastering, but it makes mastering sometimes, but mixing definitely every single time. This tiny little EQ for vocals. I know everyone goes on about the airband, but actually for me, I like the 2.5 and I like the 160, especially on male vocals. So I also use it on snare drums a lot, but I would say that this little EQ, I owned the 500 rack mount for it as well. It's amazing. I mean, the air EQ, which is what everyone goes on about, is amazing, and it's fantastic on vocals. I know Dave Pensado, I think pretty much has said on multiple occasions he uses it on every single vocal he's ever done since it came out. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it certainly is nice on vocals. But like I said, I tend to use 5K on low perk snares and claps with a little bit of 2.5, a little 160, and the 650 is nice for taking out. Sometimes you get some frequencies on vocals that don't sit nicely there, a bit nasally sometimes, boxy perhaps, but definitely for me, snares and low perk, this is on every single mix, and I would say 90% of the time on vocals. Okay, so here is another EQ, and it's not a go-to EQ, but I've included it because it has helped me out of so many scrapes. It's from Melder, and there's so much to it. It would take 2 or 3 videos to go into it. The first person I saw use it was Luca Pretolisi, and it's fantastic as obviously it's a dynamic EQ, but what's really nice about it is the saturation and the fact that you've got a wet and dry. So you can dial in the EQ that you want and then kind of blend it, with the dry signal. So it's really, really nice for that. Now, what I tend to use it on, where it's helped me out of quite a few scrapes before, is high percussion and instruments that have got a lot of high information going on. It's really, really simple to use. I love, just being able to pull that, and it changes the dynamics of it, etc. Being able to change the cue of it, it's just really hands-on, really, really easy. The high pass and low pass, high pass filters are great on it. It's pretty transparent. I would say it's 100% transparent. Actually, no, I don't want to say that because somebody's going to go, well, there's no way it's going to be able to. But it's transparent enough to me. And yeah, it's not a go-to, like I said, but it has helped me out of scrapes. And because of that, it's always, I have it kind of loaded up as a go-to. If I'll be in a certain situation, I think, I need it. It probably is on my high perk about 50% of the time, I would say. If it's not this one, it would be, I would say this is probably my more go-to for high percussion as an EQ than any other EQ. That's probably the best way to say it. So next one, now we're getting into effects. It's difficult trying to pick an effect, a delay, because there's so many, but the reason why I've picked H delay is because it is a go-to for me. It does a lot. You can get so many different styles out of it, and it's probably the delay that I've used the most. The lo-fi button, I don't know really what it's supposed to do, but it does add a nice little character. You know, a lot of these plugins will have lo-fi, saturation, all these kind of things, and I'll make my own mind up. I don't think it's a lo-fi button, and the same with the analog thing here. I'll just decide on these plugins whether I like the sound of it or not. I don't care what you want to call it. That's just marketing to me. Lo-fi, analog, all that kind of stuff. But if it imprints something that I like, then I use it. This sounds nice on analog one with the lo-fi on, and it's just a good all-round delay plugin. You can get the real dubby kind of stuff. It's got ping pong on it. It's just really easy to use. And when I'm mixing to a deadline, I don't want to be messing around with 100 different delay plugins. Valhalla do another one, which is similar to this, which is just a go-to because it's just easy. And that's what I want. You know, I would love to be able to sit around for 4 or 5 hours deciding what delay I'm going to use on my ghost snare, but I haven't got time. I just want a plugin or a piece of hardware that I just go to when I need it. I need a delay, bang on H delay. Easy, got high pass, low pass, very, very simple, straightforward, and it just does the job. I've included the EMT 140 because I pretty much use it on every single mix. Now, the way that I use this, you know, I've got this preset here, which is kind of based around a preset by Fab Dupont, a fantastic mixing engineer. And I use it in the same way that he does. And I had been using it that way, but then I saw him do a video and I was kind of like, oh, wow, he does that. And he kind of takes it to another level. So I kind of copied his preset and then I kind of tweaked it to suit me. But what I use it for is to create a space. You can barely even hear it when I use it in the mix, but I do use it in pretty much every single mix. And I'll add a little, I'll have it on as a send, and I'll send Vox to it, a little bit of drums, maybe some of the synths, guitars, horns, piano. And what it does is it just puts everything, it takes all of my band members and puts them in the same room as each other. And it's one of those plugins, the way that I use it, and it'll be at like 15% or even less, 10%. And I might even use it on the master out sometimes as well. It's one of those plugins that I'll use, and you don't have to use the EMT 140. You can use any reverb you want to do this, but I tend to use the 140 just because I always have, I suppose. Since it came out in UAD, I just love the sound of it. It's really, really nice. I've never had a chance to use the hardware of this because it takes up a lot of space, and I've never owned one, and I've never worked in a studio that had one. But I love the sound of it. Multiple companies do different versions of it, but I like the Universal Audio version of it. And yeah, like I said, so it's putting everything in a space, but it's one of the way that I use it is it'll be there and you can't really hear it. But as soon as I put it in bypass, suddenly it doesn't sound completely disjointed, but something drops, something goes. And I like plugins that do that. I like plugins with a bit of character that makes a mix a whole, gives a mix an identity. And the way that I use this very, very subtly with this preset, feel free to copy it, is in a real subtle way as a send effect, and just adding a bit of vibe, a bit of space, and putting everyone in the same room as each other. It's quite difficult to do that nowadays because we're using sources from multiple places. You know, you don't have a piano, a guitarist, a vocalist, like all sat in the same room as each other anymore. Not very often. Most of us don't have that luxury. So we're using VST pianos. We might have a live guitarist. We might have a bass player that comes in. We might have a vocalist that sings outside the room, or you might be lucky enough to have a vocal booth, but you still want them all to sound like they're in the same space. You don't want it to sound like they're all recorded in different places. That's what I use this for, putting everybody in the same place. Wow. I mean, this is a piece of hardware which I did get to use quite a lot. And there are a couple of companies that do versions of this. I love Universal Audio's version of it. Again, honestly, I'm not affiliated with them at all. And I'm not trying to get you to buy their stuff, especially considering this video was born out of me doing a video telling people not to buy new gear. So the irony of that, and I was dubious about making this video for this very reason. So you don't need to go out and buy this plugin, but it's an amazing plugin. And it's obviously based on the Lexicon 480 you pretty much, I would say a good deal of the records that you would have heard since this came out has got this on it. It's a kind of go-to reverb, digital reverb unit in studios. And I use it for vocals, it's really nice on acoustic instruments, despite the fact that it's a digital reverb. Vocals amazing. Drums, when I'm doing a lot of mixes for people that's kind of synth wave, early hip hop, electro hip hop, that kind of stuff. I use it along with the 224, the Lexicon 224 as well. Another fantastic plugin. And I had to choose which one I was going to choose because, what one do I use the most? And I would say that I use the 480 probably the most. Now just quickly going into limiters. I've got a couple of limiters here to finish off with. Pro L2 I've chosen because I use it on every single master. It's a really easy to use. It's transparent. It has a good selection of oversampling for mastering. And, you've got a good selection of different styles on there. And it's just, I don't want to say that every single mastering studio uses the Pro L2, but a good amount of them do. If you ask most engineers, mastering engineers who work in the box or inside and outside the box, but they're using in the box limiter, Pro L2 will definitely be mentioned in the conversation. They might not use it on everything. I can quite proudly say that I do. It's on every single master that I do and has been for since I've been 100% in the box. It's been on pretty much every master, I think, if not every single master. FabFilter, you can't go wrong with FabFilter plugins. They're a little bit more expensive than other plugin companies, but they're worth it. I've made back my money 1,000,000 times with the money that I spent on FabFilter plugins. And then finally, this is another quite expensive plugin actually, but the Weiss Mastering Maximizer. Now, what I do when I master, and if you've seen me do videos on mastering, you'll see that I do this. I stack 2 limiters. This comes before my Pro L2, and this does quite a lot of the work a lot of the time. And then Pro L2 will just be literally the limiter at the end. So 2 limiters stacked. Sometimes I'll stack them in a sandwich, the limiter sandwich, where I'll have the Weiss, then another plugin, maybe something with a little bit of character, bit of drive, and then I'll finish off with the Pro L2. But the Mastering Maximizer, again, super simple to use and just has a really nice, it just adds a really nice edge. I think, do you know what? I hate using this word, but it adds a bit of polish. It makes it sound pro. I hate that. But I'm going to say it because it's the only way I can really think of describing this plugin, to be honest. So I've actually got through all of them, haven't I? And I haven't actually shown you any sound through them at all. But the reason why I've done that is because it would have just gone on and on and on, and it's already gone on for over half an hour. So it would have been going into hours. So you can skip through, obviously, but that's why I haven't given you any audio examples. So there you have it. That video did drag on a little bit, and but there was no real quick way that I could do it. I will say honestly that those 20 plugins, 20 plugins if you don't count the 3 different versions of the 1176 and the LA2A, there are 20 plugins there. I use them on every single mix or master. Not both. There are some that I just use on mastering, like the Weiss, for instance. But I use them on every single mix or master, and I have done for some time. They do change a little bit sometimes. Like, for instance, the Pro Q3 from FabFilter, I'm going to be updating to the Pro Q4. But yeah, they're mostly based, I would say, on what I used in hardware. From my experience of working with hardware, back in the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s. So things like the 480 Lexicon, the SSL, the LA2A, the 1176, obviously when plugins came out, I've gravitated towards those because I used the hardware. And that's why I've continued to use them. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? If it's not, that's the saying, isn't it? If it ain't broke, I think most people just say. But I guess that's probably why I've gravitated towards those plugins. But I do use them on a daily basis. And maybe the odd new plugin might come out, the odd new compressor comes out sometimes that I might, Ash, for instance, that's quite a new one. And There's a couple that I used for a while. Unisum compressor, I use that for a little bit, but I find that I don't tend to use that very much anymore. It's a mastering compressor, and I don't tend to do much compression in mastering, to be honest. So it didn't make the top 20. But I do want to finish by saying that this video came about from the video that I made about not buying gear unless you absolutely need it. So I don't want this video to be a video where people have seen things and go, right, I need to go and buy that now. That's not the point of the video. And look, do you know what? If you want to go out and buy every single one of those plugins, go for it. Feel free to contact me and ask for the presets that I use. I'll send them to you absolutely free. I've got no problem with it. But you don't need all those 20 plugins. But that's the top 20. People asked for it. Multiple people asked for it. That's the top 20 from me at the moment. Thank you for watching. This is A Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.